Nagga. She is the only sea dragon mentioned in the entire history of the Song of Ice and Fire world. Nagga was colossal, described as being the size of an island. She breathed living lightning. She lived during the Age of Heroes in the Sunset Sea, and was large enough to hunt krakens and giant squids in the deep sea. The legend says the Grey King killed her on the shores of Old Wick. Then he used her massive ribcage as the actual beams and pillars for his palace, which became known as the Grey King's Hall. You can see 44 of these white ribs still standing on Nagga's hill. While the maesters try to claim these are just petrified trees, the Ironborn insist they are real bone. They even claim the ribs stayed warm for centuries because of the dragon's internal fire. It's the only evidence we have that dragons once ruled the oceans just as much as the sky. Terrax. She had the highest endurance of any dragon on record. Terrax was the mount of a Valyrian noblewoman named Gennara Beleris. Long before the Targaryens even thought about Westeros, Gennara took Terrax on a massive expedition to explore the continent of Sithorios. They flew further south than any human had ever gone. They stayed in the wilderness for 3 years. Terrax's main ability was her specialized respiratory system and stamina. Sithorios is filled with red death and other airborne plagues that kill humans in days, but Terrax's biology allowed her to filter out these toxins while flying through the thick, humid jungle air. When they finally flew back to Valyria, Gennara told the Dragon Lords that Sithorios was a land without end. Urrax. Urrax is the dragon famous for being the victim of the smartest dragon-slaying tactic in history. He lived thousands of years ago and was eventually hunted by a knight named Sir Serwyn of the Mirror Shield. Serwyn knew he couldn't survive a direct blast of dragonfire, so he polished his shield until it was a literal mirror. He crept up on Urrax while hiding behind it. The dragon saw its own reflection in the shield and hesitated, likely confused by what it was looking at. In that split second of confusion, Serwyn jammed a spear through the dragon's eye and into its brain. Balerion the Black Dread. Balerion was the last living link to the Valyrian freehold and the ultimate engine of destruction. He was so massive that his shadow could cover entire cities, and his scales were as thick and hard as black iron, making him essentially a flying fortress. His primary ability was his black fire, a pitch-black flame hot enough to liquefy stone. We saw this at Harrenhal, where he turned the strongest castle in the world into a molten tomb by melting the towers like candle wax. Physically, he was a brute. His jaws could swallow an aurochs whole, and his sheer weight allowed him to crush buildings just by landing on them. However, his story hides a dark mystery. In 84 AC, he disappeared to the ruins of Valyria and returned with a jagged, 9-foot-long, fresh wound in his side that was still bleeding. Whatever lived in those ruins was powerful enough to nearly kill the largest dragon in history. Balerion eventually became the only Targaryen dragon to die of old age. Vhagar, the queen of all dragons. By the time of the Dance of the Dragons, Vhagar was the oldest and largest dragon in the world. She was the only survivor of the original 3 conquest dragons, and she had grown so massive that she was nearly the size of Balerion. Her scales were thick and hardened by a century of war, making her almost impossible to pierce with conventional weapons. Her primary ability was her raw, overwhelming scale. She didn't need to be fast because her fire breath was a massive, wide-range blast of heat that could incinerate entire battalions in a single pass. Her story is defined by her 3 riders, Queen Visenya, Prince Balon, and finally, Aemond Targaryen. As she aged, she became slower but much more terrifying. She used her weight as a weapon, famously biting the head off the younger dragon Arrax mid-air. Her endurance was her greatest asset, allowing her to stay in the sky far longer than the modern dragons of the dance. She finally met her end in the battle above the God's Eye, where she was locked in a vertical death spiral with Caraxes. Even as she plummeted to her death, she was so tough that she nearly survived the impact that killed both her rider and her rival, Meraxes. She was larger than Vhagar during the conquest and easily recognized by her silver-gold scales and pale blue eyes. Ridden by Queen Rhaenys, she was the fastest of the original trio, built with a massive wingspan that allowed her to hunt at altitudes other dragons couldn't reach. Her primary ability was a pure, white-hot flame and extreme aerial agility, making her the ultimate high-speed bomber. During the Field of Fire, she was responsible for incinerating thousands by dive-bombing lines before they could even react. Her reign ended in Dorne when a scorpion bolt hit her directly in the eye, Quicksilver. This was a small, pale white dragon with scales that shimmered like liquid metal, making her a blur in the sky. First ridden by King Aenys, and later his son Aegon the Uncrowned, she was built for extreme speed and aerial acrobatics. Her primary power was her mirror flash scales, which reflected sunlight to blind enemies during a dive. Her fire was a pale, silver-white flame that was incredibly difficult to track in daylight. However, Quicksilver's agility was no match for raw power during the battle beneath the God's Eye. When she faced Balerion, he simply overwhelmed her with a wall of fire. He eventually caught her mid-air and bit her wing off, sending Quicksilver and her rider plummeting to their deaths. Vermithor, known as the Bronze Fury, was a massive beast with tan and bronze scales and wings like great leather sails. By the time of the Dance of the Dragons, he was nearly 100 years old and second only to Vhagar in size and power. His primary ability was his overwhelming physical strength and a fire breath so intense it could melt solid steel and stone in seconds. Unlike younger, agile dragons, Vermithor didn't need to maneuver. He simply tanked incoming damage through his thick, aged scales and incinerated everything in a wide, devastating arc. Ridden by the old King Jaehaerys and later the traitor Hugh Hammer, he eventually died in a brutal three-way ground brawl with Seasmoke and Tessarion. Dreamfyre was the ultimate broodmother of the Targaryen dynasty. Long before the dance, she was the mount of the troubled Princess Rhaena, and historical whispers suggest her stolen eggs were the very three that eventually hatched for Daenerys Targaryen centuries later. She was built for high-velocity pursuit, possessing a light frame and massive sail-like wings that allowed her to outturn almost any dragon in a dogfight. Her primary ability was aerial snap-turning. She could change direction mid-flight faster than the heavier war dragons, making her nearly impossible to pin down. Her fire was a brilliant azure that burned with a concentrated, piercing heat. Her end was a visceral tragedy. Trapped inside the dragon pit during the storming, she broke her chains and took flight within the confined space. Blinded by dozens of arrows, she slammed into the massive stone dome, bringing the entire ceiling down. She was crushed by thousands of tons of debris, but in her death throes, she incinerated the mob, ensuring she didn't go out alone. Meleys. Meleys the Red Queen was a scarlet-scaled terror and arguably the swiftest dragon to ever fly. Even as she grew old and heavy, her raw pace remained unmatched, allowing her to easily outstrip both Caraxes and Vhagar in a straight sprint. She was defined by her explosive kinetic speed, using powerful, copper-bright wings to reach maximum velocity in seconds. This made her a lethal interceptor that could strike before a rival even smelled smoke. At Rook's Rest, she proved her lethality by nearly ripping Sunfyre's wing from his body, showcasing a savage physical strength that complemented her blistering aerial acceleration. Meleys died at Rook's Rest, crushed and torn apart during a brutal mid-air collision against Vhagar. Caraxes the Bloodworm. Caraxes was a lean, crimson nightmare of a dragon. Unlike his peers, he was born with a freakish mutation, a neck and body so unnervingly long and serpentine that he moved more like a giant snake than a bird. This deformity was his greatest weapon, granting him omnidirectional striking. He could whip his head around at impossible angles to snap at a rider or another dragon's underbelly while his body remained out of reach. His presence was announced by a high-pitched, metallic scream that could shatter glass and disorient enemies before they ever saw him. Ridden by Daemon Targaryen, Caraxes was a seasoned veteran of the Stepstones, hardened by years of actual combat. His fire was a hot, smoky red, and he possessed a weird aggression that made him the most feared aerial combatant of the dance. He famously ended his life in the battle above the God's Eye, locking his jaws onto Vhagar's throat and refusing to let go even as they both plummeted into the water, ensuring his rival died with him. Syrax. She was a formidable, yellow-scaled dragon named after a goddess of old Valyria, but her life was defined more by the comforts of the Red Keep than the fires of war. As the personal mount of Rhaenyra Targaryen, she was kept pampered and overfed, eventually growing so large and soft that she lost the instinct to hunt for herself. Her primary skill was high-output incineration. Because she was so well fed, her yellow flame was exceptionally thick and sustained, capable of melting stone foundations with minimal effort. However, her lack of combat experience proved fatal. During the storming of the dragon pit, instead of using her wings to stay out of reach, she inexplicably descended descended to the ground to fight the mob with teeth and claws. This uncharacteristic tactical error allowed the crowd to swarm her, eventually hacking the spoiled queen to death in the mud. Sunfyre the Golden was a radiant powerhouse with scales like gold and pale pink wing membranes. He was the most resilient dragon in history, defined by an unstoppable vitality. After the battle at Rook's Rest left his wing half severed and his side charred, Sunfyre didn't die. He crawled through the soot and survived in the wild by scavenging until he could fly again. The bond he shared with Aegon II was one of the best thing about. He tracked his rider across the continent by instinct alone. Despite being mangled further by Grey Ghost and Moondancer, Sunfyre remained lethal. He spent his final days on Dragonstone, where he executed Queen Rhaenyra in 6 bites. He eventually succumbed to his festering wounds, dying as a scarred, victorious icon. Seasmoke. He was mid-sized dragon, and younger than the great warworms, he was exceptionally nimble, possessing a maritime agility that allowed him to dart through coastal storms with ease. After being abandoned by Laenor Velaryon, he spent years as a lonely, wild hunter before bonding with the dragon seed Adam of Hull. He proved his mettle in the Second Battle of Tumbleton, where he engaged in a chaotic 3-way scrap on the ground. Despite being outmatched in size, Seasmoke launched a fearless assault against the massive Vermithor to save his rider's army. He died in the mud, locked in a death grip with the Bronze Fury, sacrificing himself to take down one of the greatest threats to the Blacks. Vermax. Vermax was a vigorous, olive-green dragon with pale orange wing membranes, perfectly reflecting the youth and energy of his rider, Jacaerys Velaryon. His primary ability was Rapid Growth Spurt. Despite his young age, he grew at an accelerated rate, becoming large enough for combat much faster than his clutchmates. He was a disciplined flyer, navigating the grueling journey to the Eyrie and Winterfell with ease. His life ended abruptly at the Battle of the Gullet when he flew too low, snagging a galley's mast and crashing into the sea under a hail of crossbow bolts. Arrax. He was a pearlescent white dragon with a golden chest and emerald eyes, small enough to be nimble, but far too young for the horrors of dragon warfare. Ridden by Lucerys Velaryon, he was built for high-velocity maneuverability, capable of navigating through the treacherous, vertical storms of Shipbreaker Bay with incredible precision. His fire was a quick, bright flash, useful for distraction rather than destruction. His life ended when he was cornered by the massive Vhagar. Despite his speed, he was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Elder Dragon, who snapped him out of the sky in a single bite. Terraxes. Terraxes was the mount of Prince Joffrey Velaryon, a sturdy dragon with scales that mirrored the shifting colors of a sunset. Though he grew steadily during the early stages of the war, he was primarily confined to the dragon pit for protection, which limited his combat experience. His defining ability was close-quarters pyrotechnics. Because he was accustomed to the cramped, stone confines of the pit, he could unleash short, intense bursts of fire with lethal accuracy in tight spaces. Tragically, he never saw a true battlefield. During the storming of the dragon pit, he fought valiantly while chained, incinerating scores of small folk who swarmed his stall. He was eventually slain when the mob used his own chains to choke and restrain him. And Moondancer. She was a slender, pale green dragon with horns, crest, and wing bones of pearl. She was exceptionally lean and small, but what she lacked in bulk, she made up for with extreme kinetic agility. Because of her light frame, she was one of the fastest and most responsive flyers in the sky, capable of executing loops and dives that would stall a heavier beast. Ridden by Baela Targaryen, she was the last line of defense at Dragonstone. In a desperate dogfight, she used her speed to run circles around the much larger, crippled Sunfyre. Though she was eventually pinned and crushed by Sunfyre's weight, her relentless slashing blinded Sunfyre in one eye and left him permanently mangled. Stormcloud. Stormcloud was a young, sleek dragon with dark, smoke-gray scales and a fierce, intuitive bond with his rider, Prince Aegon the Younger. He was not a dragon built for the front lines of war. Still, he possessed an incredible high-endurance sprinting capacity that saved the life of a king. His defining moment occurred during the Battle of the Gullet, when the Triarchy fleet ambushed the ship carrying Aegon III. Though he was barely large enough to bear a rider, Stormcloud took to the sky under a heavy barrage of scorpion bolts and arrows. Despite being riddled with wounds and bleeding out mid-air, he pushed his body to its absolute limit, flying with with desperate speed back to Dragonstone. He collapsed and died in the castle courtyard immediately after delivering Aegon to safety. Tessarion. The Blue Queen was a stunning vision of cobalt and copper, a dragon whose beauty hid a savage proficiency for war. Her scales were a deep, dark blue, contrasted by wings as bright as beaten copper and belly scales that shimmered like polished pennies. Even her flames were a distinct, cobalt-colored fire. She was characterized by her aerial weightlessness. Being smaller than the great war worms, she could perform vertical climbs and tight corkscrews that larger dragons like Vermithor couldn't match. She became the MVP of the Reach during the dance, single-handedly turning the tide at the Honeywine. Unlike older dragons who relied on brute size, Tessarion used her agility to strafe enemy lines with precision. Her end came during a chaotic three-way brawl with Seasmoke and Vermithor. Even after being mortally wounded and grounded, she spent hours struggling to take flight again through sheer grit until a rain of arrows finally ended her life. Shrykos was a young dragon bound to Prince Jaehaerys Targaryen. Her defining ability was instinctive guarding, as she remained a vigilant protector within the dragon pit's confines. She never saw open battle, meeting her end during the storming of the dragon pit when the woodsman Hob the Hewer slew her with an axe. Morghul was the hatchling bound to Princess Jaehaera Targaryen, a small dragon kept deep within the dragon pit. Her primary ability was subterranean adaptability, as she spent her life thriving in the dimly lit, cavernous pits. She was tragically slain during the storming of the dragon pit, killed by the burning knight who rushed headlong into her fire. The Cannibal was a coal-black dragon, the largest and oldest of the 3 wild dragons living on Dragonstone. His scales were the color of midnight, and his eyes glowed green. He was a scavenger and a predator that feasted on the carcasses of dead dragons, unhatched eggs, and newborn hatchlings. He possessed a terrifying apex predatory presence, an aura of such primal dread that even other dragons often fled his territory on the rear slopes of the Dragonmont. Unlike many of his kin, he was never tamed or successfully mounted. Numerous dragon seed hopefuls tried to claim him during the war, but their attempts only provided the beast with fresh meat. He was a creature of pure, untamable shadow who took no part in the dance of the dragons, preferring to scavenge the losers of the conflict rather than serve a master. After the war ended, he vanished into the mists of the narrow sea, remaining one of the few dragons to survive the era entirely on his own terms. Sheepstealer. He was a wild brown dragon that lived on the back of the Dragonmont, distinguished by his ugly appearance and foul temperament. Unlike the Rhaegal dragons of the pit, he was a scavenger and a thief, possessing a stealthy, low-altitude glide that allowed him to drop silently from the clouds to snatch livestock. He had a particular taste for mutton, often raiding the flocks of the small folk on Dragonstone. He was untamable until a dragon seed named Nettles approached him differently. Instead of using whips or spells, she fed him a fresh sheep every morning until he grew accustomed to her presence. This unconventional bond made him the only wild dragon successfully claimed during the dance. He survived the war by fleeing into the mountains of the Vale, where he was eventually worshipped as a living fire god by the Burned Men tribe. Grey Ghost was a shy, elusive wild dragon named for his gray scales that blended into the mists of the Dragonmont. He was quiet and possessed an elusive instinct that led him to avoid humans and other dragons in favor of snatching fish from the shivering waters of the narrow sea. He was never tamed, as his timid nature made him difficult to track and even harder to approach. His peaceful life ended when he encountered the wounded Sunfyre. Though Grey Ghost fought back, he was eventually killed and partially devoured by the Sunfyre. She was a beauty, hatched during the final, fading embers of the Dance of the Dragons. She possessed scales of pale pink and horns and crest of shining gold, making her one of the most striking creatures of her lineage. As she was born too late for the war, she lacked the scarred hide of a veteran. Ridden by Lady Rhaena Targaryen, mourning became a symbol of hope for a dynasty that had nearly extinguished itself. While she was healthy and spirited, she was one of the last few dragons to ever reach a rideable size. Mourning died young from post-war stunting. The Last Dragon. Last Dragon was a tragic, stunted creature that lived during the reign of King Aegon the Dragonbane. She was a sickly green female with withered wings and a frail constitution, never growing larger than a dog. Unlike her ancestors who commanded the skies, she possessed a residual embers trait. Her fire was weak and flickering, barely enough to cook meat, let alone burn an army. She was born into a world where the magic of her kind was fading, and her presence was a source of deep sorrow for the king, who both feared and hated her. She produced a final clutch of 5 eggs that never hatched, signaling the end of her species. Her death in 153 AC marked the official extinction of dragons in Westeros for nearly 150 years. The Ice Dragon is a creature of legend and sailors' tall tales. Unlike the fire-breathing dragons of Valyria, these monsters are said to be made of living ice, with eyes of blue crystal and vast, translucent wings that shimmer like the aurora borealis. They possess a terrifying cryogenic breath, capable of freezing a man solid in an instant or shattering stone with a blast of cold. While many archmaesters dismiss them as mere myth, reports persist of massive shapes glimpsed through the land of always winter. They are said to be significantly larger than the dragons of the south, yet they leave no trace behind, because it is said that when an ice dragon dies, it supposedly melts away into a pool of freezing water, leaving nothing for history to prove its existence. Drogon. He is the largest and most aggressive of Daenerys Targaryen's 3 dragons, believed by many to be the reincarnation of Balerion the Black Dread. Named after Khal Drogo, he is distinguished by his black scales, blood-red horns, and spinal plates that glow with internal heat. His flames are a terrifying swirl of black and red, capable of turning bone to ash in seconds. He possesses a relentless draconic growth rate. Unlike the stunted dragons of the later Targaryen era, Drogon grew at an exponential pace, fueled by his freedom in the Dothraki Sea and the Slaver's Bay conflicts. He serves as Daenerys' primary mount. In the end, Drogon burned the Iron Throne, took Daenerys' body, and flew east toward Volantis, remaining the world's last known living dragon. Rhaegal, named in honor of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, is a formidable dragon known for his striking emerald green scales and bronze markings. It's characterized by a high-altitude predatory instinct. While Drogon is a brute force brawler, Rhaegal often displays a more calculated approach to flight and combat, circling his prey with patient, lethal grace. Though he spent a portion of his youth chained in the dark pits of Meereen, which momentarily slowed his development, he remained a powerful force of nature. Rhaegal eventually became the mount of Jon Snow, marking the first time in over a century that a dragon was claimed by a rider other than the Dragon Queen herself. Rhaegal's end was sudden and brutal, occurring shortly after the Battle of Winterfell. While he was flying toward Dragonstone with Daenerys and Drogon, he was ambushed by the Iron Fleet. Viserion, named after Viserys Targaryen, was known for his stunning cream and gold scales, which often described as the most affectionate of the 3 brothers. He possessed a molten gold exhalation, producing flames of pale orange shot through with flecks of gold. His horns, wing bones, and spinal crest were all a brilliant, glittering gold. Smaller than Drogon, Viserion was agile and fiercely loyal to Daenerys. His story took a dark turn during the expedition beyond the Wall, where he was struck down and resurrected by the Night King. His scales turned a dull, icy gray, and his fire transformed into a terrifying blue magical flame, making him a central instrument in the destruction of the Wall. Then he died because the Night King only needed a cool ride to the Wall, and the script provided a 100% accuracy buff for one night only. At the end of the day, all we can do is hope for a real ending for Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, if George R.R. Martin ever finishes the books, because until then, we're stuck with the BS ending we got on screen. Thanks for watching the full breakdown of all 37 dragons.